Today we're joined by Barry Goldwater Jr. He is a known influencer in the public and private sectors, regarded for his dynamic personality, hardworking values, tenacity, and accomplishments. A trusted advisor who partners with businesses to assist and navigate local and federal legislation with insider access to enact change. He is the co-founder and chairman and CEO of the Nelson Taplin Goldwater Group. Barry, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
So today I wanted to cover a few topics with you, including your perspectives on the business environment, how it's changed over the years, and also discuss your impressions of the Trump presidency to date. So firstly, for our listeners who may be unfamiliar with you, could you just provide us with a little bit of background on the Goldwater name and in your political background?
The Goldwaters came to America in 1850 as refugees from Poland. They settled in California as Jewish peddlers. They moved to Arizona about 1860 with a wagon full of goods and pots and pans, and grew that wagon into a department store. I grew up working in that business all my life, and then in my last year of university, my father and his partner sold that business, and I was standing there with a diploma and no place to go to work. So I moved to California, became a stockbroker, made a lot of money in the bull market of the 1960s, which allowed me to run and get elected to the United States Congress, representing a congressional district in and around the city of Los Angeles. I served 14 terms in the Congress, specializing in energy. Let's see, what else? Energy, aviation, commerce. I was involved with the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. And then after Congress, I went back into the business and started living under the laws and rules that I helped formulate. I have a business that's headquartered in Florida, but works in all 50 of the United States, doing regulatory work for insurance companies. But on the side, I also do consulting work in the areas of energy, especially renewable energy, and that's pretty much where I'm at right now.
Fair enough. And your father ran for presidency as well as the Republican nominee, didn't he, at one point in time?
Well, my father, Senator Barry Goldwater, was first elected to the United States Senate from Arizona in 1953 and served 30 years representing his state, and took a few years off to run for president of the United States in 1964 against then-President Lyndon Johnson. He was soundly defeated, but returned to the Senate and continued his work representing the state of Arizona. In fact, when I went to Congress, I served with my father at the same time. He was in the United States Senate, and I was in the House of Representatives. One of the few times that a father-son served in our Congress at the same time.
Okay, and so after that, you had mentioned you returned back to the corporate world after your time in politics. And at a broad level, with your corporate advisory, what areas of business are corporates typically trying to find insights and assistance to?
You know, I don't think that business has changed that much. It's buyer and seller, which creates a market. And as long as individuals have the freedom to involve each other with that kind of interaction, then businesses flourish. And as long as government stays out of their way, the economy generally does pretty well, and people do well. Most of our businesses today are small businesses. You always have the large conglomerates, the big ones, but you still have to rely on the mom and pops the small entrepreneurs who will take a risk, not only their time, their labor, but their capital. And I don't think that has changed from the time my great-great-grandfather came to America with a wagon full of pots and pans, trying to find a buyer. Obviously, times have changed the way we do business because of the advent of the Internet and electronics. We find communication so much quicker, information much more available, and that provides a challenge to any entrepreneur in order to master that new technology and make it a useful tool. In the days when I first started into business, we relied on the telephone and the telegraph. Then along came the fax. And I remember as a stockbroker in Los Angeles, I used a Western Union microwave direct line to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Today, we just get on our cell phones, hit a few buttons, and we do the same thing. But in those days, if you had a Western Union microwave communication system, you were on top of the game and way ahead of your competition. So the technology has changed, which has created a lot of challenges for businesses to continue to do what businesses do, and that is buy and sell things, bring buyer and seller together.
So deals are still done in a lot of the same way as you mentioned, but the technology's changed. With your advisory and having been both in politics and in the private sector, what's your experience? How should individuals approach a negotiation or a sales pitch to successfully get a deal done?
Well, first of all, I think you need to know the subject matter that you're negotiating. And that means knowing both sides of the question. And as far as negotiations are concerned, that has not really changed. You make an offer, you make a counteroffer. You eventually arrive at a consensus, and the deal is put together. I don't think that has changed one bit. It's just now the means of communication. Instead of getting on an airplane and flying from Phoenix to New York to negotiate, you can do it over the video conferencing lines. You can see each other, you can talk to each other live. That has changed. The communications, the technology has changed, but the process is pretty much still the same. And involved in that process, you have to have trust in who you're dealing and doing business with. And that's not something that's gained instantaneously. It tends to be built over time through relationships that you develop.
Now, you said it takes a little bit of give and take. Have there been examples when, these days, because everything is global, have you had to encounter dealing with, maybe a company in a different country or the issues of differences in culture where you might not be able to necessarily understand, what their wants are to address that?
Well, I think that, yes, there is differences internationally in different cultures that you're dealing with. I recall wanting to do business in Taiwan. And so I flew to Taiwan, and I had some very productive meetings with individual business people there, but came away with no deal, only with prospects of opportunities. And I realized quickly that unlike in America, when you can almost meet somebody and come to some kind of agreement, there you have to build relationships. That takes a lot of what I call drinking tea and brandy over dinners and lunches and over a period of time before both sides feel comfortable enough to engage in some kind of solid relationship based on trust, that things can begin to happen. So I find that kind of relationships, especially in China and perhaps in Japan, are not as quick as they are here in the United States. And that's something you have to get used to. And so I decided after my trip back here that I was not going to do any business in Taiwan or China because I didn't want to sit on an airplane for 13, 14 hours going back and forth. I could spend the same amount of time here in the United States. There's plenty of business to do here that I didn't need to venture outside. So I don't really do too much business outside of the United States because of that.
And how would you describe, the American business environment in terms of doing business comparatively, with other countries that you've dealt with?
Well, I don't really have enough experience to really discuss that. Most of my business experience has been right here in the United States. So I really can't address the differences.
Okay. Now, through your company, the areas that you advise on are things like compliance and profitability. Are there common issues that you tend to encounter when brought in by management to resolve or fix?
Yeah, the things that I find very very much similar is having to do with dealing with government. The relationships I have with another businessman are pretty straightforward. Too often times when you're dealing with government, you've got to go through various levels of bureaucracies and channels before you can get answers. Government moves slow. You don't, just to get an appointment with, say, a Secretary of Energy, you first have to meet with some of the underlings, and then eventually, if you really push it hard, you can get your meeting with the Secretary. Now, again, that can be modified if you already have relationships with that government-appointed secretary. And in the case of the Department of Energy, I happen to know and be very friendly with the former governor of Texas, Governor Perry, who was appointed by President Trump to be the Secretary of Energy. So I have an easier time getting to the Secretary of Energy because of my past relationships when he was the governor. But in other departments, in other agencies, where I don't have those kind of relationships, it's very difficult. And so government has no real incentive to be efficient, to be quick, to be economical. They don't have a sensitivity toward a business bottom line that requires them to be more positive in trying to help you find solutions.
And in your experience, are there particular states that you've found it easier or harder to deal with?
Not really. Again, relationships are important. So I belong to a number of different associations which allow me access to various subject matters or agencies. For instance, I belong to the Association of Governors, and I attend their quarterly meetings that they hold around the United States and have an opportunity to get a one-on-one with different governors. So over the years, I've gotten to know quite a few of the governors, and as a consequence, it's easier to do business in those states. I do a lot of businesses in almost all 50 states, and I make it a point to get to know the legislators, who the Speaker of the House is, who the President of the Senate is, the Governor, the Attorney General. I make it a point to develop those relationships. And often in counseling business, I encourage them to do the same thing, because whether they like it or not, in their business, they have a partner in the name of government. And if they're not watching government, government is watching them. So it's important that in their dealings, in their activities as businesses, they need to focus some of their attention on government and get to know and develop relationships, especially with those areas of government that impact your business. So that's what I do, and oftentimes I will encourage my client companies to do the same thing. And that includes giving contributions during election time, just to get in that door. So relationships in government, as is in business, is important.
And how does that work in practice typically? So political donations, they're typically used less to influence and more to be able just to gain access or open that door for discussion later on?
Yeah, they're primarily to open the door. And I recall when I was a congressman, nobody was going to buy me, but if somebody took enough interest to contribute to my campaign, at least I can do is give them a time of day to come in and talk and educate me and get me involved in helping them find solutions. So that's how I view, hang on just a minute, that's how I view political contributions, is it does give you access so that you can at least talk to those representatives. It's not going to buy any favors in my book, and you shouldn't expect it to.
Fair enough. Okay. And I believe that you also you do investing, or you also invest on behalf of your corporate clients. When looking at a prospective opportunity, what are you looking for initially, or what are your buy signals?
Well, that's that's always a difficult challenge, to really figure out what the hell is going on with the economy. The economy, you hope, is reflection on the marketplace, but it's not always, because you have government's involvement. And I reflect back on 2008 when we had the meltdown of the U.S. economy due to toxic housing situation. The market crashed, and nobody saw it coming. So you could, your speculative judgment was all wrong. There were a few people who were smart enough to see it coming, but most people didn't. So being able to judge the climate of the marketplace as reflected in securities is not an absolute science. So I'm often looking at the value of our dollar, our trade balances, what our Federal Reserve is doing with our monetary policy, and of course what the fiscal policies are as reflected in what our President and the Congress is doing. So there's a multitude of measurement points that you need to be familiar with and knowledgeable about. But it's never absolute, because you can never have enough information that would enable you to make an intelligent decision. As smart as you are, there's still a certain amount of risk involved in any investment or any effort in that regard.
And you mentioned federal budgets and debt. This seems to be something that has changed recently across a lot of Western nations, where they are significantly heavy in debt on, debts that don't seem like they'll ever be able to be paid off. Is that something that concerns you, or what do you think about these enormous levels of debt at a lot of federal levels across nations these days?
It concerns me greatly. And debt, it has to be paid at some point in time. And if debt is monetized like we do in the United States, that all that can do is mess up the marketplace of currencies. Ever since 2013, when the Federal Reserve was created here in the United States, our dollar has lost almost 100% of its original value because of inflation. And this all has to do with monetary policy and what's happening to our currency. We went off the gold standard, and as a result, we can print money, and unfortunately, that's what we're doing, and other countries are doing also. And you're flooding the marketplace with dollars, in this case, that just devalues the purchasing power of your currency. And that concerns me because the decline in the purchasing power impacts your earnings, impacts your businesses, and then you have the whole problem of the Federal Reserve controlling interest rates. Interest rates should be a reflection on the cost of doing business, and not on some arbitrary figure that the Federal Reserve decides that's what it should be. And as a result, money is cheap in this country. And corporations and banks are borrowing that money at a low rate and then either using that money to buy back their own stock. They don't invest it in their companies too much, but banks wind up lending it out at a higher rate. Now that's not a reflection of the market. And the sooner the Federal Reserve gets out of manipulating our currency and letting the dollar and the interest rates reflect the true market, the better off we're going to be. But every country that I know of that has been doing this is in for a rude awakening. The chickens are going to come home to roost one of these days, and everybody's going to lose.
So it's an interesting point that you brought up, because I remember a few years ago, Ron Paul sort of campaigning on the gold standard and still talks about it. Now there are a lot of people, though, as you would probably be well aware, who think that libertarianism and this sort of gold standard talk is nut job sort of talk, because it doesn't correspond to today's global markets and how you trade currency. At its very top level, can you just talk to us and explain why the gold standard, having currency pegged to something, is so necessary for underlying value?
Well, I think it gets up to it gets up to expectation. It gets up to credibility, dependability. The value of your currency should be a reflection of something of value, and if it's pegged to gold or to some commodity, you're going to have expectations that the value is exactly that, today, tomorrow, and the next day. When governments can infuse new dollars into the market, all it does is devalue the value of that currency, the purchasing power of that currency. And as a result, it truly is not a reflection of the marketplace. And people cannot have predictability and expectations. So having something of value behind your currency makes a lot of sense if you are in business for the long run. I want to know that my 401k savings is not being eroded by a falling value in our currency. I want to know that if I have $1 there, that today it's going to be the same dollar tomorrow. only increasing because of my investment or because of the dividend or interest that are earned. So stability and predictability is important in international commerce. And when you devalue your currencies by inflation, that's not healthy for the long term. And eventually, if you create all these debts that we've had, it's going to come home. Somebody's going to have to pay that debt. And it's going to be paid either in devaluing the currency or a complete collapse of the government.
Now, going back to your advisory, you work across a number of different sectors, energy, aerospace, defense, utilities, manufacturing. Trump campaigned on, being able to bring a lot of these industries back domestically because they were being, eviscerated in global trade deals. How competitive do you think some of these industries are in America compared to the global marketplace at the moment?
The United States has been able to be competitive in spite of the high standard of living that we've been able to accumulate because of our output per man hour. That can make you very competitive, even if you're competing against another nation that has lower wages, lower labor costs. If you can keep your productivity high, which the United States traditionally has, you can compete in the world market. And I think that's what's happening today. Other countries where we saw industry go to, such as China with cheap labor costs, all of a sudden their economy is growing and their labor costs are going up. So the business person is looking elsewhere for cheaper labor. But you can compete with the world market if your output per man hour, your productivity is high. And I think that's what we have here in the United States and why companies are starting to come back here. One, because under President Trump, we've greatly reduced a lot of the regulations, and regulations are expensive. They're a cost of doing business because regulations have been decreased here, and recently with the new tax laws where we've reduced the taxes on the individuals and especially on corporations. And as a result, business is starting to boom. Companies are starting to keep their factories here. The repatriation of dollars that were kept in foreign countries because of high taxation, if they brought it back here, has been eliminated. And we're starting to see money flow back into the United States from companies that just kept it outside because of the high taxes of bringing it back. So I think the United States, under President Trump, we're seeing a renewed excitement here in the United States for not only the small businesses, but for large businesses to keep their factories here, to bring work back here. And I think this is all healthy.
One of the areas that you've, in your political days, passed legislation on and that you advocate on is the area of renewable energy. As someone who, views themselves as quite knowledgeable in this area, a question that I have for you is that I continuously hear, more from the conservative side about how renewables don't work unless they're heavily subsidized by government and that they'll never meet the criteria for things like baseload power. Where are we actually up to with the capabilities of, renewable energy as something that is self-sufficient?
Back in 1974, the United States, and I think the world, but especially the United States, experienced an oil embargo from Saudi Arabia. And President Jimmy Carter, at the time, stood up and declared war on energy independence. The Congress, where I served at the time, took and created renewable energy programs and subsidize it heavily with price guarantees, guaranteed purchases, tax treatment, depreciation treatment. We did everything we could to accelerate past what would be normal market growth. We accelerated the development, the research that went into renewable energy. If you recall, back in the 70s and 80s, photovoltaics was mostly used for the space program. It cost a lot of money to light a light bulb with a photovoltaic array. But today, because of those subsidies, because of that support, renewable energy is competitive with gas and coal and nuclear. The subsidies have just about all gone away. And because that technology brought the cost of those devices down. And so today, for instance, you can build a 100 megawatt solar electric generator out in, say, the plains, out in the deserts, and sell that electricity for 3 cents a kilowatt, which is competitive to gas, which would sell the electricity generated by gas sells for about 3 or 4 cents a kilowatt. So we invested heavily in renewables. That investment is now paying off, where wind, photovoltaics, hydroelectric, geothermal, magnetohydrodynamics are all competitive with coal, oil, and gas today without subsidies. So this is being borne out because worldwide the application of renewables has accelerated and is becoming quite commonplace. And so, for instance, in Arizona, yes, a photovoltaic solar generator only works when the sun shines. Well, you have combined cycles, you have combined systems where you use the sun during the day when it's sunny, and at nighttime you fire up a gas generator, a turbine, to handle that load. So you have multiple sources of energy to handle, which was traditionally all done by fossil fuel. So now we're burning less fossil fuel because we have solar and wind and other renewables that now complement the production of electricity. So I think that's a good thing, not bad. I think conservatives have got to get up to speed on what's going on with technology and realize that we need to support renewable energy, not only because it is economic, but also it's clean. And I'm a conservative, but I like clean. I think mankind has dirtied up this globe too much. And it's time that the business community, the conservatives, those who are skeptical about renewables, need to understand that this is good, not bad. And the future is here, and we better get on board, or we're gonna miss the train.
So where does that tie in with more philosophical-based arguments of what should be subsidized and what shouldn't?
Well, I don't have a problem with subsidizing technology. If we find that technology is important, whether it's in medicine or certain products, energy, if we find that that's an important need, I don't have a problem with government subsidizing that technology. Basic research is what I'm talking about. When it comes to applied research, get the government out of it, let the private market take hold of that technology and put it to work. That's kind of my thinking on, you're basically making an investment in the future. and you could get government completely out of it and just let businesses develop things as they need them, and that would work. Sure, it would work. But if our government, the President of the United States and the Congress, determined that it is in the national interest to invest in a certain technology, whether it's to cure cancer or diabetes or provide energy or even weapons of defense, then those are investments that I think are reasonable and acceptable. I don't want to see government in the applied area. I don't want to see government doing for people what they can do for themselves. And I think that is, I don't think that's a philosophical conflict. I think it is probably more common sense than it is philosophical. And where the conservative philosophy of limited government is that we don't want government doing for the people what they can do for themselves. For instance, we have spent billions of dollars in developing a whole system of hospitalization for veteran military people, when in fact the private sector has just as many and more and probably better hospitals that those veterans could visit. So instead of spending taxpayers' dollars to fund veterans' hospitals, get the government out of the hospital business and turn that over to the private sector. That's just a classic conservative attitude and approach to certain delivery of goods and services. So we want to get the government out of our lives and out of our business and not telling us how or what to do. But I find that when you have government making investments in basic research, I think that's okay, especially when it's a national policy.
Okay. We had the chance to speak probably just over a year ago now, and since that time, Trump has moved from president-elect now to president, and he's just over a year into his term. What's your thoughts? What's your take on his first year?
Well, first of all, President or candidate Trump came along and recognized that Americans were mad. They were mad and angry over the loss of jobs, the stagnant wages, the loss of productivity, student loans that were going through the roof, with graduates living at home, and government regulations that prevented risk takers to start small businesses, banks whose loans you can't qualify, the Affordable Care Act, which was unaffordable, the loss of privacy, and President and candidate Trump recognized this feeling within the country, and as a result, he said, "I'm going to do something about it," and he was elected. He was a populist. It was a populist reaction to the phenomena that the conditions that existed in the United States. And here we are a year later, and what's the scorecard? Well, if you listen to the liberal media, which is predominantly here in the United States, you would think he would get an F. But when you scrape away all the dialogue and all the commentary and look at what he's been able to do, he gets a pretty high marks. The economy is booming here in the United States. The tax cut has created, we're starting to see higher wages. We're seeing corporations put some of that savings into their labor force. The stock market is going through the roof. He's been able to get rid of a lot of regulations which stymie businesses. He has surrounded himself with pretty smart people, He was able to appoint what I consider an excellent jurist to the United States Supreme Court. So he gets pretty high marks on accomplishment. You might look at his popularity and think, well, maybe it's suffering. But once you get away from the liberals in the big cities and you get out in the country, those folks like what Trump is saying and what he's doing. He talks their language. I was recently discussing Trump with a friend of mine, an associate of mine in New York. And he explained Trump to me this way. He said, you know, Donald Trump grew up in the bottom of New York and Brooklyn. He says, we talk like him. We understand his language. He's a street fighter. You hit him, he's going to hit you back. And that term, street fighter, really explains Donald Trump and why people are, why they are finding him fascinating. He's not the smooth diplomat Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Bill Clinton, the Bushes. He's not of that kind of caliber of president. He is a man who of action. He calls it as he is. He uses language that people don't necessarily like, and he doesn't really care. I find him fascinating, entertaining, and I am so far pleased with the accomplishments of his administration.
Is there anything in particular that you think he's done like quite well, or that you didn't expect him to be able to do, either in general or within this sort of time period?
Well, I was hoping that we could modify and perfect the so-called Obamacare health plan, which attempted to try to bring health delivery to the less fortunate, and which has failed. Most of the insurance companies have bailed out of it because of the increasing costs. People cannot afford this Affordable Care Act. And so I was greatly disappointed that under Obama's leadership, they weren't able to address that issue. He was able to get a very important tax reform passed, which is commendable. We have vast other problems that he's, I think, going to have to address, such as failing bridges, deteriorating roads. The infrastructure of this country is old and needs a big investment. Hopefully that will happen under his watch. The immigration issue is another one that is festering here in this country, and one which President Trump has taken a hard line, that we want people coming to this country, yes, but we don't want them just to come walking across the border, but we want good, high-skilled individuals who can come here and develop and make a home here, but also be able to go out and get a job or make a business and take care of themselves. Too oftentimes, many of the immigrants who come across here illegally are very unskilled, uneducated, and they wind up on our welfare rolls. And so that is a problem that this country has been dealing with for quite a long time. I'm not sure we're going to solve it under Trump, but he seems to be taking a leadership role in stopping this flagrant abuse of the niceties and the generosities of the United States.
And so, on the flip side, then, what disappoints you in him thus far?
I don't know that I have any great disappointment in him. I understand government. Government is not a nice beast. It's imperfect. Our republic is an imperfect system. But when you compare it to other governments around the world, it's still, I think, one of the best that tries to maximize freedom, that gives people an opportunity to climb as high as their hopes, their desires, and their skills, their knowledge will take them. Too oftentimes, in other countries, you have too much government and too much welfare and too much government domination. And as a result, you don't see the standards of living that you find here in the United States, and I might say in Australia. Freedom is delicate, it's perishable, and it's easily destroyed. In every free nation, you are going to be challenged by those who want more government and those who want less. And it takes you back in our beginning of time, where we had our founding fathers, Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton advocated more government, and Jefferson wanted less. And that dynamic continues up to today. It's the left versus the right, the Republicans versus Democrats. It's the New York Times versus the Wall Street Journal. It might be MSNBC or CNN versus Fox. That dynamic is still in existence as it was back in our founding fathers. That's why constant vigil is the price we have to pay for freedom.
And what about the way that I suppose out of everything that he's saying and doing, one of the things that stands out to me is the way that he's putting these sort of global arguments into social media. Like, what are your thoughts on pretty much directly using social media as an outlet to, for lack of a better term, engage in dialogue with North Korea?
Well, I think he's a genius. He has a media here in the United States that is predominantly liberal and very much in opposition to everything he's trying to do. His only recourse is to use social media to circumvent the nightly news and to get his message directly to the people. And I think that's a genius that he brings to communication with the American people. He's using modern technology to get his point across. He can't depend on the press to do it because they oftentimes distort his positions or what he's trying to do. I remember last week the three major outlets, CNN and MSNBC and CBS, spent the whole week talking about Trump. It was rumored that he was going to fire the special counsel. He never did, but they spent a whole week on the rumor that he was going to. Instead of talking about the economy, about the environment, about world politics and world dynamics, they wasted American time promoting their liberal agenda of whether Trump was going to fire this special prosecutor. So the only way he can fight back is using social media, and he's a genius at it.
And what about the talking about sort of things like finger on the trigger, like in terms of, I guess, having really lived through that age of the Cold War, is it smart to engage in, I guess, international affairs in that way? I can understand it from a domestic perspective.
Well, we have taken that kind of soft glove approach to international diplomacy most of the history of our life, of this country. And it hasn't been all that successful. And I, for one, like a president We've got to take the gloves off. It'd be tough. It's a delicate area, of course, but it seems so far to have gotten some kind of change, or at least it's created an opportunity for dialogue with North Korea. A tough stance, a hard line. The world should know where the United States stands and what our policies are. And I think too often times we are a little bit afraid to stand up for what we believe and what we want, and let the world know about it. And I think Trump's doing a pretty good job. You know, he wants fair trade for the United States instead of being a dumping place for a lot of cheap goods. Balance of payments are important to the United States, and right now, you know, we have an imbalance with China, and Trump doesn't like that, and he made it very clear that we're going to change things. So I think his dynamic leadership is respected and admired, maybe not around the world, but it sure is here in the United States.
And with sort of these insights and being able to, to talk to a lot of people and having connections in this space, one of the things that astounds me is this, for months upon months, all the way from the time that he won the election, is this talk of Russian hackers in collusion with Russia. And similar to yourself, talking about how the news is after this day after day after day, we read the same thing of how close they are to, announcing findings or classified information that's going to be released that's going to lead to his impeachment. And nothing has happened. Every day I'm reading a new breaking news about how this is going to blow this story open, and nothing is going on. What's your take on that? What are you hearing? What do you know about this?
All that is pure politics and nothing more. If you go back other administrations, and we go back just to President Obama, the Republicans beat the hell out of Obama. I mean, we just beat him up, and President Clinton, the Republicans beat him up. That's politics, and that's to be expected. The loyal opposition is going to try to make whoever's in power look bad. And that's what the Democrats are doing here in the United States, along with the help of the liberal media. And it's going to continue on, and I got to say they're doing a pretty good job of defining what and who Donald Trump is. It's sad, but it's nothing more than politics. And I don't think they're going to find out anything. I think Americans are getting tired of it, just like it sounds like you are. Let us hear something new about what's going on in the United States. And but it's pure politics is all it is.
So we know that Trump's going to run for a second term. All indications seem to have, are already shown he's registered. He's going to go full bore with this. In another 3 years' time, he'll be able to run more on his platform as opposed to saying, what he anticipates to do. If you're the Democrats, what do you try to run against here?
Well, that is a problem that the Democrats are going to have in the next elections in 2018. They don't have a message. Their message so far that they have pushed out there is all anti-Trump. They don't have a platform or a message of what they bring to the table, what they're trying to sell, what they can do for this country. And that's going to hurt their chances. Trump at least has some accomplishments that he can point to, and I think Republicans can run on those accomplishments. Obviously, this is considered an off-year election. The president gets 4 years, so this is his second year, 2018. normally the party in power loses some of their power. The predictions are now that the Democrats are going to make a lot of gains, but it's still quite a bit early for 2018, and my prediction is that the Republicans will hold their position of the White House and the Senate and the House of Representatives. It's a good record. The Democrats don't have a message.
Barry Goldwater Jr., I think that's a good place to leave it for today. I genuinely appreciate your time today and providing some insights on what's happening in the country.
Well, thank you for your interest, and thank you for the opportunity. I respect what you're trying to do and what you do, and I hope I can get back down to Australia sometime soon, especially New Zealand. The Goldwaters have a very good wine that's produced over there in New Zealand, and we drink it all the time here.
I'll have to get a few bottles from you. That sounds fantastic.
All right.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.